last week we looked just at the first 5 verses of Genesis chapter 1. And what we got from it, as well as we went through, we were kind of putting nails in the coffin of the theory of evolution, but primarily looking at the scriptures. And we learned that God created the planet, Earth, and he did it what is often referred to as ex nihilo, which is from nothing or with no pre-existing materials. He spoke it into being. Nothing existed before. And if you remember, the word that's used for that kind of creation, where there weren't pre-existing materials to make it from, uses the Hebrew word bara in scriptures. There's another word, asa, which means made. And you find the word asa used in the creation account when there are pre-existing materials and God is making something. So, for instance, God made man in his own image. Well, he made man, firstly, from the dust of the ground, pre-existing materials. That's asa. But when you come to God putting his spirit in man, then the word bara is used, because that's a...
Does bara mean Big Bang?
Take your tongue out of your cheek, Malcolm. Does bara mean Big Bang? Although when you think of it, it couldn't it? It's just that it didn't happen 14 billion years ago. It happened 6,000 years ago. I don't know what happened when God said...
Nobody knows what happened when God
did
everything.
No, exactly.
It could have been a Big Bang.
Yeah. So it might have been a Big Bang, but it wasn't the Big Bang. The one that's commonly referred to. We also looked at how evil the theory of evolution was, because it renders everything that God calls good as either just ordinary or bad. So mankind is not looked upon as special, created in the image of God, but just another animal, an ape with better DNA. And this theory of evolution promotes, because we're no better in their eyes than the rest of the animal kingdom, it makes things like abortion, euthanasia, okay. And it's been a source of racism through the years. Hitler, for example, he persecuted the Jews because he looked upon them as a less evolved race. The whole thing about racism comes from evolution. But from the Bible, you only get the fact that there is only one race and we're all part of it and we're all related to Noah and Adam. And therefore, if you go back far enough, you and me are related, and me and the guy down the chip shop, and, we're all related. So,
and Darwin himself was very strong on the fact that black people were not as intelligent as
he was, yeah. And even... Sorry, Malcolm.
No women as far as Darwin was concerned.
No, that's right. Hey, you're second class if you're a woman. Sorry, girls. Sharon and I have developed a saying: if you're doing something and you realise it's been really, really badly planned, we'll say it's probably planned by a man. Because when women plan things, they do tend to dot I's and cross T's far better than we men do. What we will find as we go on is we'll confirm that the biblical worldview and an evolutionary worldview are not compatible ever in any way, shape or form. And an awful lot of churches do try to conflate the two. You'll go to a lot of churches. I was shocked because I shouldn't have been, now I think back on it, but at the time I was quite taken aback in days of yore when I went to Southampton Community Church, now called New Community. One of the elders there, I got into a discussion with him about creation, and God used evolution, which just means God lied in the Bible. There's no other way to look at it. God lied, if that's the case. But he didn't see it my way. So that's why I don't go there anymore. Also, if you remember, we looked at the fact that God had created a planet that was made right from day one to sustain life. So right from the first day, you had rotation, because you had the darkness called night and the light time called day. You had day and night, so you had planetary rotation. And of course, that planet had to receive and sustain life, so it had to be the right temperature. And this is all before the sun was made. So everything that came subsequently was to maintain what God did originally. The source of light, we don't know precisely what the source of light was when God said, let there be light, but I suspect it was God himself, because it says he dwells in unapproachable light. And Jesus is referred to as the light of the world. So that would be my take on it. But whatever that source of light was, at some point, as we will get to, God created the sun, and the sun took on light, and it must have taken on light that didn't exist previously from, or become a light bearer. I think we'll get to it in a minute, but the heavenly bodies, if you like, the stars and so on, became light bearers. So they were bearing the light that Jesus created originally. What that looks like in your science lab, I have no idea. And even atheist scientists today agree that the world and its atmosphere and the universe is finely tuned for life on Earth, yet they deny that there was ever a fine tuner. Something we'll look at a bit more as we go on is what we had was that evening and morning the first day, and there's no reason to assume that was anything other than a 24-hour period. There are lots of theories about, every day was an age, or, every day was millions of years. There's another theory about in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a gap of billions of years. All of these theories are all attempts to kind of mash the creation narrative in with the theory of evolution. And there is no need and there is no point. The theory of evolution is bankrupt, as we'll more and more and more see. And the creation account is reliable. And if you stick to the creation account, you'll find that what you're living in on Earth is what you would expect if the creation narrative was true. You'd expect things to be the way they are. One little example, I've got a video on it somewhere, is that the sun is only young. And most astronomers will tell you it's been there for millions or billions of years, or since 14 billion years or whatever. But some closer looking at the sun tells you it's a young sun. I won't go into it in detail. A, because it's very technical. B, it's beyond my pay grade. And there's a video on it which we can look at sometime if you want to. So what we're going to do now is look at the rest of the creation week. Just in passing, we might revisit it, but in Exodus chapter 20, and I always think this is very telling when people say, well, I don't believe it was 7 literal days. And I think God used evolution. If you read Exodus 20, starting at verse 8 and reading through, I think, to the end of 11, to the end of 11, says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner or stranger who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And then I didn't plan this bit, so Numbers 15. Numbers 15, starting at verse 32. Says, now while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So when a Christian who obviously hasn't thought things through comes up with this idea that it wasn't a literal week, what kind of a God would we be worshipping if he put a man to death for breaking what wasn't even true? I mean, it just besmirches the character of God beyond measure, doesn't it? It was a literal week, and the establishment of this creation week, the reason people say, how could he have done it in just 6 days? And I'm thinking, why did he take so long? Well, there is a reason why he took so long. And that was to establish the principle of the week. Because from then on, human beings lived according to the week.
If they criticise God for being able to do it in 6 days, how come their God could do it in no time at all? Exploding nothing and making everything.
That's a very good point, because the evolutionists say it must have taken billions of years, but actually the event that started it off came from nothing, according to them. There was nothing, and nothing exploded and became everything. But the reason God established the week was so that they would have this pattern of 6 days of work and a day of rest, which is healthy. And what is interesting is that all the people who deny the existence of God still operate according to God's week. There is nowhere on the planet that has anything other than a 7-day week.
Yeah, but they aren't working on destroying God's plan. In this country particularly, they got rid of the day of rest.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So that now we don't have a 6 day.
I'm not quite as old as you, Malcolm, but one thing I do remember is that you used to not work Sundays.
That's right.
And not only did you not work Sundays, but on the rare occasion that you had to, you got paid double.
Or treble.
Or sometimes treble. Yes, Adrian.
And it's actually interesting because on one of the Scottish islands that always have Sunday, nothing open.
Yeah.
There's a big fight going on with Tesco's that's just opened up 7 days a week. All the islanders are now plotting to either get rid of Tesco's or to get it to close. Interesting enough, because we don't want to go to this 7-day week.
Is this Hebrides?
I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah, because the Hebrides is still... Yeah.
It's the one where the revival started.
Yes, and I can't bring the name to mind either. Yes.
Lewis.
That's the one, Lewis, the Isle of Lewis. But it's still a Christian community, broadly speaking. So they don't want to work Sundays. Crazy idea to work Sundays.
All the pastors do it.
Yeah. Well, it's the only parallel I would ever draw, but the priests used to do it. They used to work on the Sabbath they had special dispensation. So anyway, the whole idea of God setting up the week was to give everybody a day's rest and to apply the same principle to everybody as he applied to himself. And interestingly, that has never, ever gone away. It doesn't matter which country you live in, what the cultural background is. The two things you can find they have no other origin than God is the week and marriage. In every single culture, marriage started with God. It's never been suggested by anybody else. And various pagan gods have got on the bandwagon, and so you can have a Hindu marriage, but they still relate it to God in some way.
And we're still in the 7th millennium.
Yes, that's a good thought. Oh, come back, Lord, I can't wait. So, roughly speaking, this is what it looks like. Day 1 we've covered. Day 2, you could get the establishment of the skies and the waters above. It's an interesting one. Day 3, land, seas and vegetation. Day 4, sun, moon and stars. Day 5, fish and all aquatic life and birds. And day 6, animals and humans. And on the 7th day, God rested, not because he was tired. So let's just look at these. So Genesis 1 verse 6. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, or some of your versions will say sky. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. So the earth has rotated one more time. And it didn't take 1 billion years. So the waters, I'm not alone in what I'm about to say, but this is what it conjures up for me. So what we read in verse 1 was the Spirit of God was hovering over the deep. And he created light. And he created day and night, started the whole thing revolving. But the planet at this point doesn't have any land. It's all wet. It's all water. And God then says, separate the waters from the waters. And he says, effectively, this is translation after Ray Kelly, separate the waters from the waters, and one lot of waters are going up and the others are staying on the ground. Or no ground, because it hasn't been made yet. So they're staying on the planet. But you've got this picture, I've got this picture in my mind of the water which was at that point a single ocean, and you've got waters up there, and the effect that would have, and again, this is not from scripture, this is straight out of my imagination, and it's something that other people have said, so it's nothing new in that sense, but you've effectively got a water jacket around the whole earth so that everybody and everything alive on the earth is protected from UV radiation. You've also got the effect of, once the sun is created and starts warming that, the temperature within the water jacket would be the same wherever you were on the planet. You wouldn't have cold spots at the poles and hot spots on the equator or anything like that. You'd have an ambient temperature which God would have worked out in advance to be perfect for life. It's worth mentioning at this point that science knows a lot. They don't really know why we die. Sitting in this room with this group of people, in every single chair, the cells that you were born with are not there. There is nothing sitting in front of me that was there when you were born. Because cells, you lose cells, you gain cells, cells divide, cells reproduce. And so your body basically remakes itself during your lifetime. And I don't know how many times, and some cells last longer than others. Apparently hair cells last a lot longer, but then I've lost my hair anyway. So
some cells in the body, parts of the body, don't replicate, aren't they, if they're damaged?
True, yeah.
Like the eye.
Yes, yeah.
Things like that. The cells, unfortunately, what happens if they get damaged, they don't replicate, so the other cells actually grow to take up the space that the other cells that have died. Yeah. So they don't replicate.
But given this ideal environment where you are kept at the right temperature, you're not faced with a hostile environment ever. Like, you don't face storms and you don't face really extreme cold spells or hot spells. You don't have people on the news saying it's going to be 30 degrees tomorrow, you're all going to die. But you could exist in that climate without clothing, and in the absence of sin, that would be okay. So, once again, God has thought this through, what he created originally. And of course, modern science can't look at what we've got now, and they believe everything is now the way it always was. But it wasn't the way.
Because if we evolved, stuff's evolved, but then you're disposed of so much thinking.
Well, yes, I agree with you, Amanda. I think it's stupid, but it's what's commonly believed, because we've only this is science's biggest problem. They can only look at what's in front of them. And like us, they can't see the beginning. The difference being we do have an eyewitness account of what the beginning was like. So it's only people who reject the eyewitness account that have a problem. And they always say to us, well, you've got to prove the existence of God. And actually, it's the other way around. They've got to prove, given the overwhelming evidence for a designer, they've got to prove the absence of a God, which they can't do.
Confuse them. Ask them what's happening around the corner. Because in order to say there is no God, you must be able to see everywhere, all the time. And if you can't tell me what's happening around the corner, you can't say with certainty there is no God.
Exactly right. So, the one big point I pull out of this is that when it was originally created, this was entirely different. And we're not getting to the flood yet, but it would explain where an awful lot of the water came from. Because when you read the account of the flood, the heavens opened, there was deluging rain for 40 days and 40 nights, but the fountains of the deep opened as well. So you had water coming from both directions, which suggests a lot of volcanic activity.
And they're still open.
What, the fountains of the deep?
Yeah, they found fresh water under the ocean.
Yes, they have. It's just that they're not flooding anywhere at the moment.
No.
But they're still there. Yes, I knew that they'd found vast lakes of fresh water below the ocean floor. So that takes us to the end of a second day. We've now got a wet planet and we've got a water jacket. I can't see any other way to interpret this, and it doesn't say it's a water jacket, but I do picture that was put there and it would explain the long ages, people not dying. Was it Methuselah was 969 years old? People only started dying after the fall, and particularly after the flood. Because once the flood came, that's when ages start to reduce dramatically. And once again, the scientific community will slate you for believing that Methuselah lived to 969 years. Nobody could live that long. Well, tell me why a human being in the right circumstances would ever die. You don't. You reproduce and replenish your own cells until it goes wrong. And it normally goes wrong because of things like cancers, which come about often from exposure to ultraviolet light and things like that.
Are the efforts the same?
Yeah. I mean, we're making it easy for Satan at the moment because we keep eating rubbish as well, and far too much of it. So, we've now got the ideal climate into which God can place life. There's no hostility. When you think, we were out today, it was perishing cold, that wind. But you wouldn't have ever had that, which is why they have found fossilized fruit where you've got leeks that are 15 feet tall and things like that. And it would also explain massive animals because things grow better in those circumstances. And also why the massive animals didn't survive very long after the flood.
And the first reference to ice is after the flood.
Yes. Well, and to rain. It hadn't rained, the time when the flood came. It says specifically, rain had not fallen on the earth. So then we've got the separation of land and sea. And this seems to have taken place by the land emerging out of the sea. Let's have a quick look from verse 9. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heaven be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So it appears, therefore, that the seas have been gathered into one place and the land has come up through the water. Now, if you go to 2 Peter 3, verse 5, and 2 Peter 3, verse 5 is actually referring to after the flood had receded, I believe. But it does seem like the same principle there. 2 Peter 3 and verse 5. But let's start with verse 3, because this is, those of you who know my son-in-law Tony, this passage was what turned him. He was a vehement evolutionist. And he and I had some, well, I call them debates. I would say from his perspective, they were outbursts of anger, because he did a geology degree at university. And I had these conversations with him, and he got really quite cross with me. And then we went to a creation day held in Fair Oak, in a school in Fair Oak. There was creation ministries that held something there, and I took him along. And one of the guys that spoke read this out, and he said, this is a prophecy of what we've got today, and it speaks to people who've got things like degrees in geology and things like that. And he says, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning. Now, I didn't know this, but day one, lesson one for him at university was everything continues as it was from the beginning, and that the principle of universalism. It really brought him up with a jolt that the Word of God predicted what he was going to get taught at university. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the Word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by his word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Comforting that, isn't it, if you're an ungodly man? But this seems, again, to describe that in the time of the flood, when the waters descended and ascended from below the earth and above, that when the flood receded, the earth emerged out of that. And there's evidence of quite a lot of volcanic activity, hence you had big mountains, like upthrusts of the earth crust that created places like Everest and the Pyrenees. And found it fascinating when we did go to New Zealand, there was a lot of really craggy, massive and folded rocks. So he called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. The thing we need to make a mental note of and just keep it in our minds as we go through is everything that God saw was good. There's nothing good in millions of years of death before Adam comes along. Go on.
Everything God made was very good.
Yes, exactly.
Up until the sixth day, it was good.
Yeah, after the sixth day, it became very good.
It became very
Yes.
perfect in some translations.
Yes. Verse 11, then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day. So the principle we need to latch onto here is after its own kind. Now, there is nothing in the biosphere that doesn't reproduce after its own kind. And you can get mutations and adaptations and things like that. But what you don't get is your dog becoming something that isn't a dog, or your cat becoming a dog. Everything reproduces after its kind. And I remember somebody putting up a post on Facebook that we were talking about missing links, and there were these eels that started out this long and they got shorter and shorter and shorter, and this was flagged up as, at some point they'll grow legs and crawl out or something like that. It was some farcical discussion. But I just said, but they're still eels. They're of the eel kind. They haven't become anything that's a non-eel.
Well, like monkeys are still monkeys.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Horses evolved because they used to have toes. Right? You know, I was reading about horse evolution, and I just thought they're still horses.
Yeah.
Well, the fascinating one for me was when we went on a Norwegian cruise, and there was a whole talk given by one of the staff about whales, because we were seeing whales. And we were told with absolute certainty, that whales evolved from something that looks a bit like a cow that's called Pachycetus. And the Pachycetus is a ruminant animal that munches grass. And it evolved the ability to go back into the sea and became whales. With no... Talk about missing links. There was no explanation at all as to how the millions and millions and millions of changes needed to turn this land-breathing cow-like animal into an aquatic mammal that could survive pressure changes by going from sea surface level down to 5,000 meters and back up again, just like that. All the mechanisms it would need to do that, to develop a blowhole in the middle of your head instead of breathing through your nose and into lungs. The whole thing was just a fairy tale. And everybody was going, wow, yeah, that's amazing.
I would have been thinking, I wouldn't have been thinking something very polite, actually. Many years ago, on this, there is a very famous poster that people see a lot of, particularly in schools and colleges and things, of monkeys becoming human. Okay. Well, we were very privileged when I was nursing in the RAF. We had the late Professor Werner Wright.
Oh, yeah.
Who was one of the foremost rheumatology experts in this country, who was an out-and-out creationist in his view. He came to give a lecture one evening, and we had a lot of doctors in the hospital at that. And he said, the big problem with that particular poster is there would have come a time when actually the monkeys would not have been able to stand upright because they would have been stuck in the mud. They just would not have the ability to get to an upright stance like a human. There would have been a time in their so-called evolution that it would have been impossible for any change to happen. They would have stayed stuck where they were. It just wouldn't have happened. And I think a lot of these doctors were thinking, wow, this is interesting.
Well, I freely admit, when I was head of health and safety in various companies, I used to use creation in what I was teaching. So, for instance, my favourite one was when I had to teach them about looking after their hearing, not exposing them, but wearing their ear defenders basically when they're presented with noise. And so up on the board would go the diagram of the human ear. And I always used to say, how anyone can think that this just evolved is completely beyond me. Because what you've got in the human ear is a supreme piece of engineering. Not only is it a supreme piece of engineering, and we'll probably do it at some point just for fun, but not only is it a supreme piece of engineering, but it's integrated because your brain hears a sound and makes a file in your little mental filing cabinet, which is why mothers can be in a house full of people with their kid asleep upstairs and the child upstairs are going, eh, and mother will immediately go, what was that? Because they're programmed to respond to that sound which their brain has taken in and learned, and they'll recognize their own child's cry over a different child's cry. So it's not just a question of hearing, it's a question of hearing being integrated with other functions of the brain. Anyway, we digress. But it'd be good to look at some of these systems, because when you think, could something have evolved? You have to ask the question, so before it evolved and during the millions of years it was taking to evolve, how did they live? And yeah, you finish up with some interesting conundrums. So once the land had appeared, and again, as I've said, it's probably come up from below and probably as a result of some volcanic activity, but the Lord then causes vegetation to grow. Now, given that the earliest society was vegetarian and the animals were also vegetarian, it actually shows really good planning. There's nothing random about this. The vegetation arrives first. There is therefore something to eat. And then God creates the animals. We only became carnivorous after the fall of man, described in Genesis 3. So there was a move away from vegetarianism at that point. But this principle of reproducing after their own kind, each vegetation had its seed in it and reproduced after its own kind. That principle carries on through all of creation. So even when you have got normal sort of mammal sexuality, you still need a seed. And the only difference between that and vegetation is that the seed is in the man and the egg that's fertilized is in the woman. Whatever species you're looking at, that's the case, isn't it? But there's still a principle of seed and replication after one's own kind. I do look at some of the people around today and wonder if it's true that they're of the same kind. But you do have to wonder. They are all God's creatures. But if you didn't know that, you would wonder. So this principle is important for us, and it's the one thing that bankrupts the theory of evolution. Because if this is true, if everything reproduces only after its own kind, then nothing can have evolved. And as soon as something does evolve, then the creation account becomes bankrupt. You see, it's the line that can't be crossed.
And the most impossible ones to evolve would have been homosexuality, because mankind would have died out of first generation.
Yeah.
It would, you're right. And what's interesting as well is when you do mess with the genetics, so you can get a lion to mate with a tiger and produces, I can't remember which way round, but ligers or tigons. But they're always sterile. They live one generation and die. So, and they're always cats. Thanks for the reminder. It's true, they are always cats. But but the real point is, God has built into the whole thing that you can't cross kinds and have an ongoing successful species. It lives. They do the same with a horse and a donkey. You can you can mate them, and you can produce one generation of mixed offspring, but they can't carry on and mate. They die out in a single generation. So it's anything that tries to cross kinds finishes up sterile. Kinds are not the same as species, I've put on the board. I'm not even going to go into what the difference is, except that God's kinds are God's kinds. So science would separate out lions and tigers as separate species. God would say they're cats. A bit like Malcolm. They're all cats.
No, he's not.
No. So everything reproduces after its own kind, and that has I've never been able to find an example of that being broken.
That's why God destroyed the earth.
Because things are not fair.
Yeah,
Because the angels
because angels tried to mate with humans.
with humans, and also Sodom and Gomorrah was basically the same principle, because the men were trying to have relations with angels.
Yeah. It makes you think, doesn't it, that with what's going on at the moment with transhumanism, the end cannot be that far away. So I've just got a little exercise that I want to do, and I apologise in advance if this is too involved for some people. At times it's a bit too involved for me. But what I just want to spend a moment looking at is how unlikely it is for any of this to happen by a random process. And it means spending a bit of time not in the scriptures. But I think when we come back to the scriptures, it makes it more meaningful. And when evolutionists tell you that it all just evolved by natural processes, it's handy to have this mental picture of just how impossible that is. And what I do find strange is when I use an example like this with atheist scientists, they always poo-poo it, but they never answer it. So what I want to look at, this is an example to, if you wanted to produce a small part of a single strand of DNA through just a random process, what would have to happen? And I'm going to use an example from our use of our own alphabet, because the DNA molecule, we just go to the next slide, the DNA molecule is a very, very complex molecule. And effectively, what you've got is what they call a double helix. So those those pictures on the left, you've got this double helix, and the helix is joined by chemicals, which are proteins and base pairs. And the short version of this is, they join across the groove in between the strands like this, and these chemicals have to be compatible, otherwise it would just blow apart. And they're all left-handed, there aren't any right-handed ones. So although the right-handed chemicals do exist, you can't use them for DNA. DNA has to be left-handed ones only. And you can see from that, I was going to say the middle one, but it's the first one to the right of the middle. That's just a diagrammatic figure that just shows how much is packed into such a small space. Now, those chemicals that join, you can look upon them like a language. You can look upon them like an alphabet. The difference being, whereas our alphabet has 26 letters, that alphabet has something like 14 billion letters. So you've got 14 billion possibilities of how these chemicals could join and where they could finish up in the molecule if you ever get them to join. So already you're thinking, yeah, that's not going to happen by accident. That's got to be put together. So as an example, and I'm already feeling Keith's pain at this point, because I remember when I've tried to do things like this in the past, sometimes his brain goes tilt, and that's okay. What we're going to assume, you remember, was it a guy called Huxley said, if you had 6 eternal monkeys sitting at 6 eternal typewriters, just randomly striking keys for eternity, at some point they would produce the complete works of Shakespeare. And everybody kind of goes, well, I suppose it could happen. Actually, it couldn't happen. This was Huxley's argument in the day against a man called Wilberforce, not the one that broke the slavery, but his son. And the argument they had was, he said, there's no way this could happen, but put on the spot in the middle of a debate, how do you provide the proof? So the example I've taken, I got from Creation Ministries International, and it came off their website. If you imagine that we've got this typewriter, and it's going to be an ape-friendly typewriter, so it's going to have only 50 keys. So it'll have capital letters and 10 numbers and a space bar and punctuation. So you've got a very limited typewriter. So we're making it easy for the evolutionists, really, because we're making it easier to get it right than if you had a real typewriter. So if you had these user-friendly apes and these user-friendly typewriters with just 50 keys, and you wanted to type out by random key strikes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," how long would it take you to have some chance of getting that? Just those, and that's 42 letters, not 14 billion. That's 42 letters taken from an alphabet of 26 letters, plus punctuation and space bars. If you create that situation, according to the multiplication rule of probability, and this is a simplified version of that rule, the chance of correctly typing the 3 designated letters "the" from all the potential possibilities. So you've got your 50 keys and you're randomly striking the keys, and you're striking once every second. The probability is 1 in 50 times 50 times 50, which works out at 1 chance in 125,000 of striking the right key each time. But you've not got to strike, it's not just the T you've got to strike the T followed by the H followed by the E, which gives you this probability of 1 chance in 125,000. So at a rate of 1 strike per second, that would take you 34.72 hours just to get the word "the." But then you've got to remember that the word "the" has got to be followed by the correct word. So that gets scrapped if the next word isn't Lord, or if the next letter isn't an L. You scrap it and start again. But just to get the word "the," you can expect it to take you 34.72 hours. The problem is, though, it doesn't have to happen at all. You could carry on striking keys forever and never get the word "the," but you're going to be, on average, at least 34 3/4 hours. The chance of randomly typing 8 keys, which is 7 letters and 1 space, to get the words "the Lord" is 1 in 50 times 50, 8 times, 50 times 50 times 50 times, which works out to 1 chance in 39,062 billion. Now, there are 31,536 seconds in a year. So the average time taken in years to make 39,062 billion strikes at the rate of 1 strike a second would be 1,238,663.7. The 0.7 could be important. Years. Now that's just to get 2 words from a 26-letter alphabet. So if you want to see really ridiculous, if you had to type the whole of verse 1 of the 23rd Psalm, so you've got 42 letters, punctuations and spaces, it would be 5,042 divided by that number of seconds in a year. It works out, trust me on the math, it works out 7.2 times 10 to the 63rd power years, which is 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 63 times. It's not going to happen. There comes a point when probabilities, although you could say, well, if you give it enough time, it could happen, which is what they say. 14 billion years is not enough time. And there does come a point where you have to say, actually, it's never going to happen. This is not like tossing a coin where 50% of the time it's going to come down right. And this doesn't even account for the left-handed ones that are being discarded, the right-handed ones that are being discarded along the way. The probabilities are, one scientist worked it out. I mean, to type the whole of the 23rd Psalm, you're looking at a probability of 9.552 times 10 to the power of 1,016, which works out to a billion years, right? It's a lot more than the Earth has been around. By the evolutionists' own figures, the Earth hasn't been around long enough for it to have happened, even if it ever did happen, because it doesn't have to happen, because it's only probability, it's not certainty. So I just thought I'd throw that one in because it just helps us to realize that we have got the evidence on our side, and the idea of random evolution is utterly, utterly bankrupt. And you probably already knew that, but it's nice to see some figures that bear it out. And it's difficult to get figures that bear it out because the actual calculations are so massive, you couldn't do them. If you tried to work out the probabilities of this kind of success with a 14 billion letter alphabet, you just couldn't do it, could you? So one needs far more than blind faith. One needs far more blind faith to believe this than we as Christians have in the fact that this is the work of our genius creator God. And I have put this to people when I was in the HSE, and there were a few of my colleagues were quite scientific, and I brought out something like this. They would always go, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Well, tell me why. You know.
That's why when people say it's ridiculous, like, yeah, they don't give you a rebuttal to.
It's the commonest debate tactic. Is to go, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." Then correct me. I always say that. Well, then correct me. If I'm wrong, show me. When we come to this is taken from the bottom bullet point. If you did want to chase it down, this is the source of this information. This is a quote. When we come to examine the simplest known organism capable of independent existence, the situation becomes even more fantastic. In the DNA chain of the chromosome of the bacterium E. coli, a favorite organism used by molecular biologists, the DNA helix consists of 3 to 4 million base pairs. These are all arranged in a sequence that is meaningful in the sense that it gives rise to the enzyme molecules which fit the various products used by the cell. In other words, it can't be any other way. It has to be the way. So that's an arrangement, a very specific arrangement of 3 to 4 million base pairs. This unique sequence represents a choice of 1 out of 102 million alternative ways of arranging the bases. We are compelled to conclude that the origin of the first life was a unique event which cannot be discussed in terms of probability. So I don't think Ambrose was a Christian, although he did conclude that to think of the origin of life as just a matter of probability was stupid. So, light. This will be quicker. I'm not going into theories of distant starlight and stuff like that tonight. It's another one that's beyond my pay grade. So, verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens and to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. It's kind of an offhand comment, you know. And while he was at it...
It's understatement in the world. when you look at that statement, and I've got a book with that title, the universe God made, and we don't know how big it is.
No.
And it's covered by that statement. The rest of the Bible basically is covering the salvation of mankind.
Yeah.
So he writes 5 letters to cover the whole of the universe.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the Bible to cover our salvation.
And he's still making them. Isn't there a scripture that tells God is still making stars? No,
that's the evolutionists who don't know how the universe was created, because God said he finished his work on the 6th day. He stopped working on the 6th day. The whole lot was done.
I just like the fact that it's kind of, you know, and he made the sun and he made the moon. And while he was at it, he made the stars.
But the other thing about that is, if the stars weren't all made at the same time, we would have had, well, the Earth, first of all, would have crashed into the sun. And then you've had all the rest of the universe crashing into itself. They all had to come about at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. They all had to come about at the same time. It is possible, and I have not a clue whether it ever happened, but it is possible that the process of stars forming was part of God's creation. And so when people look through telescopes and see what they say, you know, we saw this star being born, Did they, didn't they? I don't know. Something's happening out there. It's not all static. It's still expanding and it's still happening. But, well, and he called them all by name. So,
He didn't say there was some that were going to come on later.
no. It does make you wonder what it is that's floating around out there that's gone bang and shattered into lots of bits. But hey. So, where were we? And he made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. There is one thing in this that people claim as a contradiction, and it's not. And that is that it talks about the sun being the great light and the moon being the lesser light. And scientists will say, yeah, but the moon doesn't have any light of its own. Well, that's not a contradiction, because where it says, where the word govern, God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. Govern simply means to dominate. It doesn't mean it's got any control or power. And people did worship the sun, but they shouldn't have, because the Bible very clearly says don't worship the sun and the moon. But even on days when the sun's out and you know the moon is there in the background, you can see it. It's not dominant. Right? The sun dominates the day and the moon dominates the night. And it does shed light because it reflects light from the sun. So it gives out light, just not light that it's produced itself. So it's not a contradiction, as some people would claim that it is. So then we come to day 5, where God fills the sea and the air with living creatures. Verse 20. Then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heaven. God created the great sea monsters, and the word created there is bara. Right? So he created from nothingness. There was no flesh, bone, or anything like it. And God created it. So the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. So we've got creation from nothing reintroduced here to get flesh and bone. And we've also got, you've got animals these are aquatic animals, but being placed into the climate that God has previously created so that they can thrive. And it's interesting because I heard somebody having a scriptural debate about what it was that was flying above the earth, and they were talking about flighted dinosaurs and things like that. And this is birds. It says birds. In Hebrew, the word birds means birds. So the flying animals, flying squirrels and whatever else can fly, wasn't part of this. This was just birds. And that makes sense too, because you've got vegetation, and vegetation's producing seeds, so the birds have got something to eat. It did leave me wondering what the sea creatures were eating, because they weren't eating each other in those days. There must have been some plant life in the sea too, but that's just my brain going on a little trek. The other thing that struck me was, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. I've been snorkeling in one or two interesting places, and I've swum through shoals of fish. And they can be really dense, like going into a cloud. Everything about God's creation is abundant. You think we've been trying to overfish the sea ever since, and yet we haven't got rid of them all yet. There was a lot of all reproducing after their own kind again. Never lose that. Everything must reproduce after its own kind. I'll move on. And we're going to go down as far as, verse 25. Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And we're going to leave man for next time, because I think he deserves a session of his own. But once again, we have this bara creating flesh. If you were to look at verse 25, it says, God made the beasts of the field after their kind. That word is asa, it's not bara. Right? He already had the materials from when he created the flesh of the aquatic animals. It wasn't created out of nothing, it was created out of pre-existing materials that he'd created the day before. And after their kind, once again, we're not going to get a non-fish from a fish. I think I want to finish with this thought, coming back to the DNA molecule and everything else. We don't even know. You know, when you store stuff on a computer disk, the disk is not the information. The disk simply contains the information. We don't actually know whether the DNA that we make such a lot of fuss about, and it is remarkable, so it's worth making a fuss about, but is that the hardware or the software? People think if we just create the right chemicals, we can create life. No, you can't. Because you can take a dead animal, or if the dog down there was actually dead rather than looking as if she's dead, if the dog was dead, she's got all the genetic stuff she needs, all the chemistry is right. You can't make it live. So the element of life is something beyond the DNA. And scientists for years have been trying to create life in a test tube, and they claim to have done it once or twice, but they haven't. What they've done is they've taken something that was alive and grown it in a test tube. They've not created life from nothing in a test tube, because it's not, I would think of it as it's the software, not the hardware. You can have the hardware, there's the hardware lying on the floor, but you need the software to make it live. And that's a whole other realm, which we will never fathom until the day we get to ask the Lord. And that's me done. I hope you enjoyed it.